All right, let's get this out of the way. The Inquisition is terrifying. Not terrifying in the way a rampaging tyrannid swarm is terrifying, or a chaos incursion boiling out of the eye of terror. No, this is a colder, quieter kind of fear, the kind that creeps up on you in the dead of night when you're not even sure you've done something wrong, but somehow you feel watched. The kind of dread that wraps around your spine like ice, because you know that if the Inquisition is coming for you, it doesn't matter who you are. Planetary governor, high-ranking priest, decorated general, you'll disappear just the same. No trial, no explanation, just silence, and maybe a crater where your city used to be. And yet, somehow, we don't talk about them as much as we should. They're not flashy like the Space Marines. They don't command massive armies like the Imperial Guard. They don't burn through the galaxy with the psychic fury of the Grey Knights or shake the void with the power of the Titans. They operate in the shadows, often alone or with a small, terrifyingly effective retinue. But their reach, it's everywhere. Their authority, absolute. They answer only to the Emperor, and even that is debatable, because the Inquisition doesn't wait for divine instruction. They interpret it, they embody it, and that, right there, is what makes them so deeply unsettling. There's this old saying among Imperials, innocence proves nothing. It sounds dramatic, almost theatrical, until you realize it's not just a motto, it's a policy. The idea that being blameless means absolutely nothing if the Inquisition thinks you might pose a threat to the Imperium. That's the kind of moral vacuum we're dealing with. It's not about truth or justice in the way we understand those words. It's about survival. Survival of the species, of the human race, in a galaxy where demons literally exist, where alien gods whisper across dimensions, and where even thinking the wrong thought can doom an entire planet. Within that context, the Inquisition isn't just a tool of tyranny. It's a firewall. An ugly, brutal firewall, but one that has kept humanity alive for 10,000 years. Now, I'm not saying that justifies what they do. Not even close. Plenty of fans argue over this all the time. There's this ongoing debate in the lore community about whether the Inquisition is a necessary evil or just plain evil. Some say the Imperium would have collapsed millennia ago without them. That heresy, chaos, corruption, Xenos infiltration, it all would have torn us apart if the Inquisitors hadn't been there, cutting out the rot, no matter how painful. Others point out the atrocities, the paranoia, the countless innocent lives sacrificed on suspicion alone. Exterminatus-level decisions made because of vague intel. It's not just morally gray, it's pitch black. But that's what makes them so fascinating, right? They blur every line. They are the enforcers of an empire built on repression and fear, and yet they genuinely believe, many of them at least, that what they do is righteous. That they must do these things because the alternative is extinction. It creates this wild cognitive dissonance where someone can commit planetary genocide and still think they're the good guy. And what's even wilder, sometimes they're right. Sometimes their brutal methods do stop a chaos cult from opening a warp rift in the middle of a hive city. Sometimes that one heretic they burned was about to trigger a technovirus that would have spread like wildfire. That's the horror of it. The Inquisition wins. Not with glory, not with parades, but with silence, fear, and the occasional smoldering ruin. And it's not like you can ever really pin them down. The Inquisition isn't a single organization, not really. It's this sprawling, decentralized web of individuals and cabals, each with their own beliefs, methods, and secret wars. They don't even agree with each other half the time. One Inquisitor might burn a world for harboring mutants, while another protects a psycho child because she's the only one who can foresee a coming catastrophe. There's no consistency, no oversight, no predictability. Which makes sense, because how do you govern the people who govern everyone else? This is part of what makes reading about them such a unique experience in the 40K universe. Most factions have a theme, a vibe. The Inquisition is more like a contradiction that somehow sustains itself. They're both the cure and the disease. They represent the Imperium's desperate need for control and the moral price of maintaining it. It's like the Emperor built a sword that can only cut, and then handed it to people who genuinely believe every shadow might contain a traitor. And that's the part that always gets me. The Inquisition is terrifying, yes, but it's also deeply human. These are people trying to hold back the collapse of reality itself, with nothing but their convictions and a license to kill. Some of them fall into madness, some become tyrants. But others? Others are genuinely trying to do the right thing, in a universe where right is a constantly shifting target. They're walking that razor's edge every day, knowing one misstep could doom billions, but also knowing that not acting could be even worse. So yeah, you want to know what the Inquisition is? It's not just some secret police force with skulls on their armor and flamers in their hands. It's the darkest mirror of the Imperium's soul. It's what happens when survival becomes the only morality. And if that doesn't send a chill down your spine, it should. If you're trying to understand the Inquisition, one of the first things you need to realize is that it's not a monolithic structure. It's not like the Adeptus Astartes, with their codex-defined chapters, or even the Astra Militarum, with its regimented chains of command. The Inquisition is messy. It's decentralized. It's more of a philosophy than an institution in some ways. But for the sake of navigating the chaos, most of the Inquisition organizes itself into 3 major factions, or ordos, and each of them has its own nightmares to deal with. Think of them as different flavors of paranoia, each one tasked with protecting the Imperium from a particular existential threat. The most well-known, probably because they're the most visible in the lore, is the Ordo Hereticus. These are the witch hunters, the scourge of internal corruption, the ones who root out heresy within the Imperium itself. They're the reason that faith in the God Emperor isn't just a virtue, it's practically mandatory. And they don't just go after heretical cults whispering secrets in the lower hives. No, they'll come for anyone they suspect of harboring deviant thoughts, from rogue psychers to rebellious governors, even high-ranking members of the ecclesiarchy if need be. Some fans call them the Emperor's paranoid watchdogs. Others say they're the necessary immune system of a diseased and bloated empire, and maybe they're both. Then you've got the Ordo Malleus. These are the demon hunters, and let me just say, you have to be insane to sign up for this gig. Because these inquisitors don't just fight demons, they study them. They stare into the abyss, catalog the abyss, and sometimes, if they have to, negotiate with it. Yeah, that's a thing. The Ordo Malleus walks this razor-thin line between purity and damnation, and the fact that some of them manage to stay sane, or at least functional, is nothing short of miraculous. They're the ones who work most closely with the Grey Knights, those silver-armored paragons of psychic warfare, but make no mistake, the Ordo Malleus is the one holding the leash, or at least trying to. There's a deep admiration in the fanbase for these guys, but also this undercurrent of unease. Like, how much of the warp can you study before it starts studying you back? And then there's the Ordo Xenos. If you're into space horror, clandestine biology experiments, and interspecies espionage, this is the Ordo for you. These inquisitors specialize in dealing with alien threats, whether that means negotiating with rogue Eldar factions, dissecting Tyranid specimens, or purging entire systems where genestealer cults have taken root. They're the ones who treat every Xenos race as a potential existential threat, and honestly, they're not wrong. The Imperium's policy toward aliens is basically exterminate on sight, but the Ordo Xenos knows that sometimes understanding your enemy is just as important as destroying them. That duality, knowledge versus annihilation, is what defines them. And of course, this leads to a lot of internal suspicion. A Xenos Inquisitor who's been seen consorting with Eldar might just be walking a very thin line between radical insight and outright heresy. What's wild is that even though these 3 major ordos cover the big threats, heresy, demons, aliens, that's not the whole picture. There are smaller, more specialized ordos that exist in the shadows of the big 3, like the Ordo Sicarius, which monitors the officio assassinorum, or the Ordo Redactus, whose job is to erase knowledge itself when it becomes too dangerous. I've even seen fan theories about secret ordos that don't officially exist, the kinds of things you only find in obscure Black Library novellas or half-burnt codices. One idea that comes up now and then is that there's an ordo that monitors other inquisitors, like an internal affairs branch for an organization that already considers itself above all oversight. Chilling thought, right? And here's the real kicker. These ordos aren't competing agencies. They're more like ideological ecosystems that sometimes collaborate, sometimes clash, and sometimes ignore each other entirely. You could have an Ordo Malleus Inquisitor and an Ordo Hereticus Inquisitor working the same war zone, both thinking they're doing the Emperor's will, yet operating under completely different priorities. One's hunting demonic incursion, the other's purging mutant psychers, and they might just end up pointing their bolters at each other before the day is out. That kind of internal conflict is a feature, not a bug. It keeps the Inquisition fluid, unpredictable, and immune to stagnation. But it also makes it incredibly dangerous, not just to its enemies, but to itself. There's also this interesting cultural detail. Many Inquisitors don't formally align with an Ordo at all. They might start out in one, sure, get their training, build their network, but later they branch out, follow their own path. These are often called Ordo Minoris, or Rogue Inquisitors, depending on who you ask. Some see them as the purest expression of inquisitorial authority, answering only to the throne, beholden to no doctrine. Others see them as potential loose cannons, prone to radicalism, obsession, or worse. And that ambiguity? It's intentional. The Inquisition thrives on mystery, on keeping even its own agents in the dark. Honestly, when you look at it all laid out like this, it's almost overwhelming. You've got entire careers, entire lifetimes devoted to chasing just one type of threat. And even within those categories, there are layers upon layers of specialization, ideology, and personal agendas. No two Inquisitors are ever quite the same, even within the same Ordo. It's like 1,000 different people trying to hold the Imperium together in 1,000 different ways, each convinced they're the only one who truly understands the threat. So yeah, when people talk about the Inquisition like it's one unified entity, I just kind of laugh. It's not unified. It's not even really organized, at least not in the traditional sense. It's a crucible, a test, a weapon pointed in every direction at once, including inward. And maybe that's the point. In a galaxy where every truth is dangerous and every enemy hides in plain sight, maybe the only thing more terrifying than the threats the Inquisition hunts is the Inquisition itself. When people ask how the Inquisition operates, they usually expect some kind of military structure, a hierarchy, a command chain. But that's the thing. It doesn't work like that. The Inquisition is almost deliberately designed to not function like a normal organization. It's built to be unaccountable, fluid, and completely outside the rules that govern the rest of the Imperium. That's what makes it so terrifying. An Inquisitor doesn't need permission, doesn't need backup, doesn't even need to explain themselves. They just act. And if you question them, you're probably already under investigation. See, Inquisitors are granted what's often referred to as the Mandate of the Emperor. That's not just a fancy title. It's a license to do anything they deem necessary in the defense of humanity. And I mean anything. They can requisition armies, commandeer starships, override planetary governors, execute high-ranking officials on suspicion alone. And if they really feel it's justified, they can wipe entire planets off the galactic map. No trial, no debate, just a quiet word, a sealed order, and then fire from the heavens. This is where the dreaded exterminatus comes into play. That word sends shivers down the spine of every Imperial citizen who's even heard it. It's the final solution, the absolute last resort, or at least it's supposed to be. In reality, it's used more often than anyone wants to admit. When a planet is deemed too far gone, too corrupted by chaos, too infested by Xenos, too riddled with heresy, an Inquisitor can order its complete destruction. Orbital bombardment, cyclonic torpedoes, virus bombs, you name it. It's not about punishment, it's about containment. If the infection can't be cured, then the patient must be burned. Simple as that. But here's the thing that always gets to me. No one can stop them. There is no authority above the Inquisition except the Emperor himself, and he isn't exactly returning their calls. Not the High Lords of Terra, not the Adeptus Mechanicus, not even the Custodes, unless they have a very good reason. This level of unchecked power is both awe-inspiring and deeply, deeply dangerous. Fans love to debate whether this was a brilliant design or a catastrophic flaw in Imperial governance. Some argue the Emperor intended it this way, giving the Inquisition ultimate freedom so it could act quickly and without political interference. Others think it's a consequence of the Imperium's paranoia spiral, just one more layer of control stacked onto a regime already choking under its own weight. The methods Inquisitors use, they vary wildly. That's part of the chaos. Some are subtle, relying on infiltration, informants, psychological manipulation. Others are hammers, burn everything, sort it out later. There are Inquisitors who go decades without revealing themselves, operating behind layers of disguise, sowing discontent to expose traitors. And then there are those who arrive in Thunderhawks, banners flying, declaring themselves in the name of the God Emperor, demanding obedience or death. Both are valid, both are terrifying. One thing that always stands out to me is how they borrow power. An Inquisitor doesn't have a standing army, not usually, but they don't need one. They can requisition forces from almost anywhere. The Astra Militarum, the Adeptus Mechanicus, even the Astartes if the situation is dire enough. Imagine being a planetary governor and getting a visit from an Inquisitor who just tells you they're taking your elite regiment, your supplies, and your ships. You don't argue. You can't. You just nod, pray, and hope they leave before they decide you're suspicious too. This independence is what makes them effective, sure, but it also makes them unpredictable. That's part of the horror, really. You never know when they're watching. You never know what they're really looking for. And even if you think you're in the clear, even if you've done everything by the book, they might decide that the book is wrong, that you are the book's weakness. And then, it's over. What really creeps people out is how often they don't explain themselves. They show up, do something extreme, and vanish. No record, no report, sometimes no survivors. The Administratum might not even know why a planet vanished from the registry. Just a blank space, maybe a few rumors of heresy or Xenos contamination, but no proof. Because the Inquisition doesn't leave proof. It leaves absence, holes, silences, and that silence speaks louder than any decree. Now, not every Inquisitor is a monster. I've read stories, maybe apocryphal, maybe not, about Inquisitors who genuinely try to protect the innocent, who agonize over every decision, who try to minimize destruction instead of leaning into it. But even they're trapped by the same system. The moment they hesitate, the moment they start asking themselves if the ends really justify the means, they become vulnerable to the enemy, to doubt, even to other Inquisitors. Because showing weakness can be interpreted as corruption, and corruption must be purged. There's a popular fan theory that the Inquisition, for all its independence, is slowly becoming what it was created to fight, a self-sustaining cycle of suspicion, secrecy, and purges. Like, it started out as humanity's immune system, yeah, but now it's metastasizing into a cancer of its own, consuming everything, not out of malice, but out of an inability to stop. Because how do you ever really know that heresy is gone, that a demon threat has been fully contained? You don't. So you keep hunting, keep burning, just in case. And maybe that's the scariest part. The Inquisition isn't just a hammer. It's a philosophy, a worldview where nothing can be trusted, not even yourself. Where absolute power is not only accepted, it's required. And the people who live in that world for too long, they change. They become shadows of what they once were. Maybe that's the price of survival. Or maybe it's the beginning of something worse. Either way, when the Inquisition knocks, no one sleeps easy. So let's talk about the people behind the rosettes, the Inquisitors themselves. Because honestly, this is where things get really interesting. You'd think, with how terrifying and monolithic the Inquisition feels from the outside, that its agents would be more or less the same, rigid, faceless enforcers of imperial will. But no, that couldn't be further from the truth. Inquisitors are some of the most individualistic people in the entire Warhammer 40k universe. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that individuality is practically a requirement, because to survive in their world, let alone thrive, you have to be more than just ruthless. You have to be unforgettable. There's no standard path to becoming an Inquisitor. Some are trained from a young age, handpicked as acolytes or interrogators by senior Inquisitors who see potential in them. Others are elevated later in life, former soldiers, psychers, scholars, even repentant heretics, believe it or not. Yeah, that's a thing. There are documented cases, well, semi-documented, of individuals who once dabbled in forbidden knowledge and then flipped, using their insight to serve the throne. Some fans argue those are the most dangerous kind, not because they're unreliable, but because they know exactly how deep the darkness goes. And they're always dancing on the edge of falling back into it. What's really fascinating is how wildly different their personalities can be. Some Inquisitors are charismatic visionaries, capable of rallying entire systems to their cause through sheer force of will. Others are cold, detached, practically machine-like in their logic. And then there are the fanatics, the ones who burn first and ask questions never. The grim, fire and brimstone types who treat mercy as a kind of heresy. You know the ones I mean. The ones who quote the Lectitio Divinitatis while standing in the ashes of a hive city they just purged. They genuinely believe they're saving souls, even as the bodies pile up around them. But not all of them are monsters. That's the tricky part. Some are wise, like actually wise, cunning, experienced, emotionally intelligent. Inquisitors who've spent centuries navigating the darkest corners of the galaxy and still manage to hold on to some sliver of compassion. They're rare, but they exist. And when they show up in the lore, it hits different. Because you get this glimpse of what the Imperium could be if it weren't so obsessed with fear and repression. These are the Inquisitors who ask why before they ask how many must die. And even though they still make hard decisions, sometimes horrifying ones, they do it with full awareness of the cost. Then you have the brilliant madmen. I'm not even exaggerating. Some Inquisitors are completely unhinged in the most terrifying and effective ways imaginable. I'm talking about people who've gone so deep into their work that they've lost touch with everything except the mission. They might talk to skulls. They might hear the Emperor's voice in their dreams. They might keep demonic artifacts locked away in personal vaults, just in case. And the wildest part? Sometimes they're right. That artifact? It might be the only thing capable of stopping a warp breach. That voice in their head? Could be a warning, or it could be madness. No one knows, not even them. I remember reading a fan theory once that said all Inquisitors eventually go insane. It's just a question of how. Some implode, others become tyrants. A few become martyrs, sacrificing everything because they genuinely believe they're the Imperium's last hope, and some somehow manage to stay human. But none of them come out clean, because how could they? Their whole job is to confront the ugliest truths in the galaxy: demons, heresy, Xenos infiltration, the total fragility of human civilization, and then do something about it. That kind of responsibility breaks people, or reshapes them into something else. And the ego. Oh man, the ego on some of these people. You almost have to be arrogant to do this job. To look at a planet full of billions and think, I might have to kill all of you to save the rest. That's not a decision a humble person makes. There's a reason so many Inquisitors become living legends, feared and revered in equal measure. They walk into a room and everyone goes silent, not because they demand respect, but because they are respect, or fear, or both. And the craziest part? Many of them don't even see themselves as important, just necessary. Of course, you get your share of megalomaniacs, the ones who believe they are the law, the ones who twist their mandate into an excuse to reshape the Imperium in their image. These are the ones who start cabals, who manipulate sector politics, who rewrite history and suppress knowledge to maintain control. Are they protecting humanity? Maybe. Are they just feeding their own power complex? Also maybe. But who's going to stop them? Other inquisitors? Good luck. They're just as compromised, just as convinced that their truth is the right one. There's this quote that floats around the fan base, and I think it sums things up perfectly. Every inquisitor believes they are the last sane person in the galaxy, and they act accordingly, which is terrifying, sure, but also kind of beautiful in a twisted way. Because the galaxy is insane. It does need people who are willing to make impossible choices, to face horrors most humans can't even imagine. And whether they're noble, ruthless, wise, or completely deranged, every inquisitor is, in some way, a reflection of the Imperium itself. So yeah, next time someone says inquisitor, don't picture just one kind of person. Picture a spectrum. From torch-wielding zealots to soft-spoken manipulators to broken veterans who've seen too much. Picture someone who has stared into the abyss and didn't blink because they couldn't afford to. And then ask yourself, could you make the same choice they did? Would you want to? Because in the end, the question isn't just who the Inquisitors are, it's what they've become, and what they force the rest of us to become, just by existing. If there's one thing that sets the Inquisition apart from pretty much every other force in the Imperium, it's not just the authority, it's what they can wield with that authority. And I'm not talking about some standard-issue bolt pistol and a stern expression. I mean entire arsenals, specialized kill teams, psi weaponry that would make an Eldar flinch, and even armies that technically shouldn't be taking orders from anyone short of the High Lords of Terra. But for the Inquisition, they make exceptions. Always. Let's start with the most visible tools, the war gear. An Inquisitor's personal armory is like a museum of deadly curiosities. There's no standard loadout. Some carry ancient plasma pistols powered by lost technologies. Others wield demon blades, cursed weapons barely held in check by layers of wards and sheer force of will. And yeah, that's a thing. Inquisitors have been known to intentionally bind weapons with warp entities, walking the razor's edge between power and damnation. It sounds insane, but when you're going up against the raw chaos of the universe, sometimes purity just isn't enough. Sometimes you fight fire with the burning core of a dying star. Then there's psi weaponry. The Inquisition is one of the few imperial institutions that not only tolerates psychers, but actively cultivates them. Many Inquisitors are powerful psychers themselves, trained in sanctioned psychic disciplines, or let's be honest, sometimes unsanctioned ones. The warp is a weapon in their hands, one that can tear through armor, bend minds, or scour a soul from a body like ash from a flame. And for those Inquisitors who don't possess psychic abilities personally, they often surround themselves with sanctioned psychers, telepaths, and astropaths who act as both tools and warning systems. It's terrifying to think about, but in the right hands, a psyker is more valuable than a battalion of tanks. In the wrong hands, well, that's how demon hosts happen. Ah yes, demon hosts. You know you've reached peak Inquisition weirdness when someone willingly binds a warp entity into a living vessel just to interrogate it or use its power. It's heretical as hell, technically speaking, but again, we're talking about people who define their own morality in real time. Some fans argue this kind of radicalism is necessary in a galaxy full of enemies who don't play by the rules. Others think it's the beginning of corruption, the moment when an Inquisitor starts becoming the very thing they claim to fight. And maybe both are true. That's the terrifying duality of the Inquisition in action. But what really blows me away is the kind of people Inquisitors can call upon. Their retinues are wild. No two are the same, and some of them are like RPG parties made entirely of unhinged specialists. You've got death cult assassins, emotionless killers, trained in rites so ancient no one remembers who created them. There are gun servitors, lobotomized humans fused with heavy weaponry, turned into semi-sentient turrets. arco-flagellants, who are basically walking execution engines driven by pain, chemicals, and faith. And then there are more subtle assets, savants who remember everything they've ever read, chirurgeons who can dissect a xenos with surgical precision, even remembrancers who record every moment of an Inquisitor's crusade for posterity. And let's not forget the real muscle. Some Inquisitors have authority over full military detachments. They can call in the Astra Militarum, requisition Imperial Navy ships, and even command certain chapters of Space Marines, though that last one is more complicated. Most Astartes chapters technically don't answer to the Inquisition unless there's a crisis, but if the right Inquisitor with the right history shows up, doors open, especially when it comes to the Grey Knights. Now, the Grey Knights are a whole different beast. They're the chamber militant of the Ordo Malleus, meaning they were specifically created to combat demonic threats, and they are terrifying. Clad in silver power armor, immune to corruption, wielding weapons inscribed with so many wards they practically glow, these guys are the Emperor's psychic scalpels. Every one of them is a psyker. Every one of them is trained to fight demons in close combat. And when they show up, you know something truly awful is happening. What's crazy is how secretive they are. Most of the Imperium doesn't even know they exist. In fact, if a guardsman fights alongside them and survives, standard procedure is memory erasure or a bullet to the head. No witnesses. The Sisters of Battle, too, often find themselves serving Inquisitors, especially those of the Ordo Hereticus. These are warrior nuns armed with flame and fury, singing hymns as they march into battle. And unlike many of the Imperium's forces, they genuinely believe in the purity of their cause. You don't just get loyalty from them, you get zealotry. It makes them incredibly powerful tools, especially when rooting out heresy. An Inquisitor flanked by a squad of sisters? That's not an investigation. That's an execution waiting to happen. Then there are the agents within the Officio Assassinorum. 4 major temples, each one specializing in a different kind of death. The Inquisition doesn't control them directly, but again, exceptions are made. If an Inquisitor files the right request, gets the right approval, they can have a Calidus shapeshifter infiltrate a court, or a Vindicare sniper put a bolt between someone's eyes from kilometers away. The kind of surgical strikes that change the course of a war before it even begins. What makes all of this even more wild is how seamlessly Inquisitors can blend all these tools together. One mission might look like a covert psyker retrieval, using stealth, trickery, and mind control. The next could be a full-blown planetary assault with tanks, air support, and an Astartes strike force leading the charge. It's not just about power, it's about versatility. Inquisitors are resourceful because they have to be. Every threat they face is different, unpredictable, and sometimes outright unknowable. So they gather tools like a magpie gathers shiny things, diverse, deadly, and often just a little bit cursed. There's even this theory among fans that the tools an Inquisitor chooses say more about them than their words ever could. The ones who favor psychers and forbidden tech, probably radicals. The ones who stick to traditional bolters and pure warriors, likely Puritans. It's a window into their worldview, into how far they're willing to go, and what lines they refuse to cross, if any. So yeah, when you think of the Inquisition, don't just think about shadowy figures in cloaks. Think about what they bring with them. The relic weapons, the arcane knowledge, the living weapons disguised as men. Think about the fact that if they decide you're a threat, it won't just be one person knocking on your door. It'll be an entire nightmare, tailor-made just for you. And by the time you realize what's happening, it's already too late. If there's one emotion that defines the Inquisition more than anything else, it's fear. Not the loud, panicked kind that erupts when a tyrannid bio-titan crashes through your city walls, or the desperate terror of watching a demonic rift tear open the sky. No, the fear of the Inquisition is quieter, colder. It's the fear that you're being watched, that someone heard the wrong word you muttered after a sermon, that the wrong book in your private library has already sealed your fate. And the most chilling part? You might never know until it's too late. That's because the Inquisition operates on a level of secrecy that's honestly mind-blowing, even by Imperial standards. Everything about them is cloaked in layers of obfuscation, misdirection, and deliberate misinformation. You can serve the Imperium faithfully for your entire life, decades of unquestioning loyalty, and still have no idea what an Inquisitor actually does, or what they even look like. And that's by design. Knowledge is power, sure, but in the Inquisition's world, knowledge is also poison. It corrupts, spreads, lingers in shadows. So the fewer people who know anything concrete about their operations, the better. Even their identities are slippery. Inquisitors rarely use their real names if they even have them anymore. They operate under aliases, kill records, swap identities as needed. One week they're a merchant with a cargo hold full of spices. The next, they're declaring exterminatus on the very planet they just docked with. Some high-ranking Imperial officials, governors, cardinals, even admirals, go their entire careers without ever meeting an Inquisitor. And if they do meet one, they remember it for the rest of their lives. Assuming they survive, of course. It's this uncertainty that breeds such intense fear. Because how do you prepare for something you can't predict? How do you defend yourself against an enemy who might be standing in the room with you, disguised, silent, judging everything you say and do? That's the brilliance of their system. Inquisitors don't need to be everywhere. They just need people to believe they might be. And in a society as deeply paranoid as the Imperium, belief is more powerful than presence. I've read lore fragments and old fan write-ups about entire worlds whose ruling councils lived in a permanent state of dread because a single Inquisitor had passed through a generation ago and never made their final report. No one knew what they'd seen or what they'd concluded, so the entire planet just froze. Constant audits, overzealous purges, families turning on each other in the name of preemptive loyalty, all because one person might still be watching. That's the kind of psychological warfare the Inquisition excels at. Even among the upper echelons of Imperial power, the Inquisition is regarded with a strange mix of reverence and terror. The High Lords of Terra might technically hold more political authority, but even they tread carefully when dealing with Inquisitors. Because while an Inquisitor might not have the power to command the High Lords, they can investigate them. And once an Inquisition investigation starts, all bets are off. Records vanish, officials disappear, evidence is manufactured, burned, rewritten. The truth becomes whatever the Inquisitor says it is. This leads to an atmosphere where no one wants to talk about the Inquisition. You don't speak their name lightly. You don't joke about them. You definitely don't ask questions. It's like invoking a curse. Even the rumor that an Inquisitor has arrived in system is enough to throw entire administrations into chaos. People burn documents. Churches hold emergency masses. Arbeits officers check and double-check their own files, afraid they'll find something that might be seen as suspicious. Because in the eyes of the Inquisition, suspicion alone is often enough. And that's where the real fear lies. The arbitrariness, the unpredictability. An Inquisitor isn't bound by any code you can understand. They don't need to explain themselves. They don't operate by precedent or logic as we know it. You could be a loyal servant of the Emperor and still be branded a heretic if they see something you missed, or something you never understood was wrong in the first place. There's no appeal process, no second chances, just judgment. There's this persistent fan theory I love, that the Inquisition has deliberately seeded false narratives about itself across the Imperium. Like, maybe half the stories we hear about them are exaggerations they put out, not to glorify themselves, but to maintain control through myth. The idea that somewhere out there is an Inquisitor who can read minds at will, or one who's centuries old and never sleeps, or another who travels with a demon host on a golden leash. Whether they're true doesn't matter. What matters is that people believe they're true. Because belief, especially in the Imperium, shapes reality more than facts ever could. What's so brilliant and horrifying is how efficient this system is. The Inquisition doesn't need mass deployments or constant oversight. Their presence is like radiation, invisible, silent, and lethal in the long term. They make fear into a governance strategy. a silent, persistent pressure that ensures obedience far more effectively than banners and speeches ever could. You don't want to be the person who accidentally catches their attention, because even if you survive that kind of scrutiny, you're never the same after. You start second-guessing every word you say, every action you take. That's the true power of the Inquisition, not in what it does, but in what it might do. So yeah, when people ask why the Inquisition is feared even by the Imperium's elite, the answer's simple. It's not because they kill, it's because they could, at any time, for any reason, and no one, not even the most powerful cardinal or battle-hardened general, knows exactly where the line is until they've already crossed it. One of the most fascinating and honestly disturbing things about the Inquisition is that for all their shared authority, all their solemn oaths and fire and steel iconography, they don't agree on anything. I mean, they agree that the Imperium must be protected, sure. But how to do that? What that even means? That's where the whole thing starts to fracture into this complex web of ideologies, rivalries, and downright philosophical warfare. And this isn't some academic debate. They're not arguing over tea in a quiet library. These disagreements can and have led to purges, assassinations, even civil wars within the Inquisition itself. At the heart of it all, there's this fundamental divide: Puritans versus radicals. It sounds simple, but trust me, it's anything but. Puritans believe in maintaining the absolute sanctity of the Imperium. No compromises, no deviations. They see the Emperor's will as something pure and unchanging, a divine truth that must be obeyed at all costs. These are the inquisitors who burn first and ask questions never. They view alien technology as heresy, warp-tainted tools as corruption, and moral ambiguity as the first step toward damnation. To them, the path to humanity's survival is a narrow one, and any step off it, no matter how well-intentioned, is a betrayal. On the other hand, radicals believe that in order to fight the threats facing the Imperium, you sometimes have to use those very threats. The warp, Xenos technology, demonic artifacts. They see these things as tools. Dangerous, yes, but not inherently evil, just misunderstood. To a radical, the purity the Puritans cling to is not just naive, it's suicidal. The galaxy is burning, and they argue that old dogma won't save anyone. You've got to get creative, adapt, bend the rules before they snap entirely. That kind of thinking opens up endless possibilities and just as many risks. This ideological rift isn't just about methodology. It's about identity. It shapes everything an Inquisitor does. Who they recruit, what threats they focus on, how they justify their actions. A Puritan might see a radical's decision to ally with a rogue trader who trades in alien relics as outright heresy. A radical might see that same rogue trader as a valuable asset in understanding and countering an emerging Xenos threat. And that disagreement? It doesn't get resolved with a friendly debate. It gets resolved with bolter fire. But it goes deeper than just Puritans and radicals. Within those broad camps are even more nuanced factions. You've got Amalathians who believe the Imperium should be preserved exactly as it is, stable, rigid, unchanging. Then there are monodominants, who believe that anything non-human should be wiped out entirely, no exceptions. It's not just about tactics with them, it's ideology as weapon. Their purity isn't just religious, it's genocidal. On the radical side, you get factions like the Xanthites who study chaos in order to better fight it. And yes, that's as risky as it sounds. Some have tried to harness demonic power, thinking they can bind it, control it, repurpose it for the good of mankind. Most of them either die, disappear, or fall so deep into corruption they stop being inquisitors at all. There's this old lore piece, some say it's apocryphal, others swear it's canon, about a secret council of inquisitors who meet every 100 years to judge whether their peers have gone too far. Not to determine guilt by action, but by belief. Imagine that. A room full of the most powerful agents in the Imperium, deciding whether one of their own should be silenced because of what they think. It's like a paranoia Ouroboros. The system policing itself so hard it eats its own tail. And honestly, that makes sense. The Inquisition is built on the idea that no one is above suspicion, not even inquisitors, especially not inquisitors. That's where terms like Inquisitor kill teams come in, units assembled not to purge heretics or demons, but to take down rogue inquisitors. It's rare, sure, but not unheard of, and when it happens, it's brutal. Because these aren't just traitors. These are people who know how the system works, who have access to all the same resources, who can manipulate the same fears they once used in service of the throne. One of the most hotly debated cases in fan circles is the Horusian philosophy, named after, you guessed it, Horus himself. These are inquisitors who believe that a being with the power and charisma of Horus could be reborn, not as a traitor, but as a savior. That the Emperor's failure was not in trusting Horus, but in not shaping him properly. Horusians want to find or create that new being, someone who can unify the Imperium, possibly even replace the Emperor as a living god. You want controversial? That's it. That's the line between radical and heresy, and they're tap dancing all over it. There's something kind of poetic about it, though. The Inquisition, which exists to root out deviants, is itself a breeding ground for some of the most divergent thought in the galaxy. These are people who deal with the unimaginable on a daily basis. Of course they're going to process it differently. Of course some of them are going to break. Of course others are going to evolve. And the scariest part? You can't always tell which is which until it's too late. Some fans argue that this internal division is what keeps the Inquisition strong, that without ideological tension, it would stagnate. Others think it's a ticking time bomb, that eventually these philosophical rifts will widen into full-blown civil war. And honestly, both views are valid. Because if history has shown us anything, it's that dogma alone doesn't hold the Imperium together. Fear does. And the Inquisition, they fear each other almost as much as they fear the enemies of mankind. So when you think about the Inquisition, don't imagine a united front. Imagine 1,000 silent wars being waged in the shadows. Ideologies clashing not just in words, but in blood. Inquisitors spying on each other, sabotaging each other, all while claiming to serve the same divine purpose. It's messy, it's dark, it's deeply human, and it's exactly what you'd expect from an organization that believes the survival of the species is worth any price, even turning on its own. It's easy to get caught up in the grim glory of the Inquisition. All that power, the authority to act in the name of the Emperor himself, the legends of demons banished and planets saved. But if you dig even a little beneath the surface, if you read between the lines of history and lore, you start to see something darker, something rotten. Because the Inquisition, for all its righteous proclamations, is not immune to corruption. In fact, in some ways, it's uniquely vulnerable to it. And that's the irony that keeps so many fans awake at night. The organization meant to protect humanity from corruption is itself one of the most dangerously corruptible forces in the entire Imperium. The first thing to understand is that Inquisitors answer to no one. That's not just a dramatic flourish, it's a structural reality. No oversight, no regular audits, no one watching the watchmen. And when you give someone that kind of unchecked power, even with the best intentions, you're playing with fire. There have been documented cases, some whispered in data vaults, others lost to purges, of Inquisitors using their authority to carve out personal empires. Entire subsectors ruled not in the Emperor's name, but in their own. They start by purging a rebellious governor, then stationing their retinue there for security. A few years later, they're setting policy, collecting tithes, deciding what's heresy and what's just inconvenient truth. There's a particularly infamous example that gets brought up a lot in fan circles, the Tricorn conspiracy. It's not in any official codex, of course, but it's one of those deep lore rabbit holes where the more you look, the less certain you are that it's fiction. According to the theory, a cabal of high-ranking Inquisitors operating out of a fortress on Terra itself began subtly rewriting archive data, eliminating rivals, and manipulating planetary records to make themselves indispensable. Over time, they became a shadow power behind multiple sectors, not just influencing the Imperium, but actively steering its direction, possibly even in defiance of the throne. Some say they were eventually discovered and purged. Others say they still exist, hidden under layers of false identities, quietly shaping history while the rest of the Imperium fights over scraps. And it's not always about politics. Sometimes the darkness is personal. There are stories, hard to verify but impossible to forget, about inquisitors who developed obsessions, not with power but with people, ideas, even relics. One might become convinced that a particular psycho child is the key to humanity's salvation and burn entire cities to keep her safe. Another might believe that a forbidden Xenos artifact is the last hope for defeating chaos and sacrifice loyal servants to keep it secret. It's not just megalomania, it's faith twisted into something unrecognizable. And because they believe they're doing the Emperor's work, there's no line they won't cross. Then there's the matter of outright heresy within the Inquisition itself. And yes, it happens. More than you'd think. Because when you spend your life studying the enemy, demonology, Xenos biology, rogue AIs, you start to understand them. And sometimes, that understanding turns into fascination. Sometimes, fascination turns into reverence. And before anyone realizes what's happening, you've got an Inquisitor who's no longer purging cults, but leading one. Or worse, hiding one within their own network. The scariest part, these people don't just vanish overnight. They go deep. They build loyal circles. They learn how to hide in plain sight. And since no one wants to believe that an Inquisitor could fall, most people turn a blind eye until it's far too late. There's also this running theory in the lore community that entire ordos might have been compromised at various points in Imperial history. Not just individuals, but whole branches. Like, what if an entire Ordo Minoris was founded as a front for a chaos cult? Or if a radical cell became so convinced of its own righteousness that it started quietly rewriting Inquisition doctrine from the inside out? You'll never find official confirmation, of course, but every now and then, a data slate gets redacted or a record of an Ordo just disappears. Not archived, erased. And the silence around those absences? It speaks louder than any proof ever could. But the biggest, most persistent scandal in Inquisition history has always been its own civil conflicts. When Inquisitors turn on each other, it's not just messy, it's catastrophic. Because they don't fight with restraint. They use everything at their disposal. Propaganda, assassins, full planetary purges, the infamous Istvan incursion. Some believe it began not as a response to Xenos activity, but as a power play between rival inquisitorial factions. Entire worlds burned so two ancient ideologies could settle a grudge. And if that sounds absurd, remember, Inquisitors don't think like normal people. Their enemies are concepts, corruption, weakness, the potential for danger. So if they believe that their rival's philosophy could endanger the Imperium, then that rival is fair game. No matter how many innocents get caught in the crossfire. There's also a very human element to all this. Jealousy, fear, pride. Inquisitors are still people after all, just people with unimaginable power and impossible responsibilities. It's not hard to see how someone could start cutting corners, justifying small compromises for the greater good. And once you start down that path, it's not long before you're the one doing the purging, just to cover your own tracks. Some fans go even further and suggest that the Inquisition has already gone too far, that it's no longer a guardian of humanity, but a self-perpetuating engine of control and fear. That maybe the true heresy isn't the demons or the Xenos, but the idea that anyone can be trusted to wield such power without becoming something monstrous. And honestly, they might be right. Because the more you learn about the Inquisition, the more you start to realize that its greatest strength, its autonomy, is also its greatest weakness. There's no safety net, no fallback. When an Inquisitor falls, they don't just bring themselves down. They take entire sectors with them, and in a galaxy already on the edge of annihilation, that's a level of danger that's hard to justify, even in the name of the Emperor. The Inquisition of the 42nd millennium isn't the same beast it was in ages past. It's still terrifying, still secretive, still cloaked in fire and silence, but something has shifted. The galaxy has changed. The Great Rift tore open the stars. Half the Imperium is drowning in warp storms. The dead walk. The gods of chaos scream louder than ever, and the enemies of mankind are closing in from every direction. And right in the middle of it all is the Inquisition, trying to hold the line with blood-stained hands and no room left to retreat. If you ask me, the Inquisition today is more desperate, more fragmented, and more dangerous than it's ever been. The old codes, the carefully whispered doctrines, the unspoken rules about how far was too far, they're breaking down. Some inquisitors still cling to tradition, trying to maintain that impossible image of divine authority, calm in the storm. But others? They've thrown subtlety out the airlock. They burn faster, strike harder, act before the question is even finished. And who can blame them? Every moment of hesitation could be the one where a demon slips through, where a cult detonates a reactor, where a tyrannid spore fleet burrows in, and no one notices until it's already too late. You can feel the strain in the stories coming out of the current setting. The Indomitus Crusade gave the Imperium a sliver of hope, but that hope comes with a blade. Guilliman's return shook everything, including the Inquisition. Some welcomed him. Others saw him as a potential threat. A living Primarch, walking among mortals again. That's not just a logistical shift, it's a theological one. The Ecclesiarchy doesn't know how to process him. The Inquisition? Even less so. There's debate now, real and dangerous, about how much power should be concentrated in the hands of a single being, even one anointed by the Emperor himself. And while the old threats are still very much alive, chaos cults, Xenos incursions, rogue psychers, the New Age has brought new horrors. The Cicatrix Maledictum isn't just a tear in the galaxy, it's a wound in the psyche of humanity. It breaks communication, fractures reality, makes whole sectors disappear for decades. And when those sectors come back, they're never the same. The Inquisition has to respond without data, without context, without allies. You get lone Inquisitors boarding ships that haven't reported in since before the Rift, hoping to uncover the truth. Sometimes they find survivors. Sometimes they find demons. Sometimes they become the thing they were hunting. Even their methods are shifting. More and more you see Inquisitors embracing technology that used to be considered borderline heretical. AI fragments sealed in data coffins. Xenotech harvested from battlefield ruins. Psi constructs built from warp echoes. There's less concern about purity and more about efficacy. If a tool works, you use it and deal with the consequences later. That mindset? That's what a lot of fans point to when they talk about the creeping radicalization of the modern Inquisition. It's not that they want to break the old rules, it's that the rules don't fit anymore. The game changed. Now it's about survival. And here's where it gets weird. In some parts of the Imperium, the Inquisition is no longer whispered about in fear, but worshipped. Literal cults have sprung up around the idea of the Inquisitor as a divine judge, not a servant of the Emperor, but a prophet in their own right. Entire hive cities holding parades when an Inquisitor arrives, not understanding that their cheers might be silenced by a purge within the hour. It's like the myth of the Inquisition has grown too big, too disconnected from reality. The fear is still there, but it's warped. In some corners of the galaxy, people offer themselves for judgment, begging to be found worthy. Others hide entire generations underground the moment an inquisitorial sigil appears in orbit. Meanwhile, within the Inquisition itself, the fractures we talked about before have deepened. It's not just Puritan versus radical anymore. It's militant versus covert, expansionist versus isolationist. You've got Inquisitors who believe the Imperium should go on the offensive against the warp, colonize and cleanse wherever they find taint. And then there are those who think it's time to fall back, consolidate, let humanity shrink into defensible strongholds and wait for the storm to pass. If it ever does. And yet, for all the chaos, for all the internal collapse and external pressure, the Inquisition still functions. That's the strangest part. It still sends out its agents, still eradicates cults, still unearths threats, still eliminates rogue elements with brutal efficiency. It's like some half-alive machine that keeps moving forward, even with pieces missing, even when its own gears grind against each other. Some say that's proof of the Emperor's will, still guiding his instruments even in madness. Others say it's just inertia, too much death, too much momentum, too many secrets to ever stop. There's even talk that the Inquisition has started experimenting with infiltration methods they never used before, posing not just as nobles or merchants, but as ordinary citizens, embedding agents in cults and letting them rise just to track their full reach before purging them. Inquisitors living decades undercover, becoming part of the heresy they're meant to destroy. It's a level of psychological warfare that goes beyond even what the Officio Assassinorum deals in. And if those agents lose themselves along the way, well, no one will ever know. That's the cost. So what does the average Imperial citizen think of the Inquisition now? It depends on who you ask. In the darkened cathedrals of hive-world spires, they are angels of wrath, untouchable and holy. In the lower levels, in the gutter-cant whispers of the underhives, they're monsters, ghosts in armor who vanish families for reasons no one understands. On frontier worlds, they're a myth, a story told to scare children or inspire them. And on war-torn planets caught in the madness of the rift, they're hope, brutal, merciless hope. The only thing worse than hearing the Inquisition is coming is hearing they're not. And honestly, that says everything. The Inquisition today isn't a force of order. It's a symptom of a galaxy unraveling. A weapon forged in a more stable time, now being wielded in desperation. And maybe that's what makes it so dangerous. Because when your only tool is absolute authority and your only directive is survival, the line between salvation and annihilation starts to blur real fast. So, after diving through the labyrinth of secrets, power, heresy, fear, and fanaticism that defines the Inquisition, we're left with a simple, terrifying question. Is the Inquisition humanity's greatest protector, or its most dangerous enemy? And the truth is, I don't think anyone, not even the Inquisitors themselves, can give you a straight answer. That's the beauty and the horror of it. The Inquisition isn't just a faction. It's a reflection of everything that makes the Imperium of man so compelling, so grotesque, so painfully human. It's what happens when survival becomes the only metric for morality, and where action, no matter how monstrous, is justified by the mere possibility of a greater threat. It's not black and white. It never was. The Inquisition exists in this endless gray space, and honestly, that's why it sticks with me more than almost any other part of the Warhammer 40K universe. Because here's an institution that's willing to destroy the innocent just to stop a threat that might exist. That's terrifying. But at the same time, when you look at the alternatives, galaxy-ending warp breaches, Xenos gods, psychic implosions, suddenly that level of paranoia starts to feel almost reasonable. That's the most disturbing part. You start to understand why they do what they do. And once you understand it, part of you starts to agree with it. That's the Inquisition's most subtle weapon. It makes you complicit, not through force, but through logic, through necessity. It whispers to you, tells you that the only way to survive is to become something colder, harder, less bound by ideals, and more by outcomes. It dares you to ask yourself, what would you do if you held that power? And the moment you try to answer that question, you realize how far the corruption can go. Not through ambition, but through compromise. There's a quote I came across once in a fan discussion, and it stuck with me for years. The Inquisition doesn't burn heresy to protect the Imperium. It burns heresy so the Imperium doesn't have to see what it really is. That hits. Because so much of what the Inquisition does is about hiding things. Not just threats, but truths. The truth that the Emperor might not be a god, that the warp is more unpredictable than controllable, that loyalty and heresy are sometimes separated by the slimmest misinterpretation. The Inquisition doesn't protect innocence. It erases it, so people can keep believing there's something pure left to protect. And yet, somehow, despite all of that, I don't hate them. I should. Objectively, they're terrifying. They destroy lives, ruin civilizations, operate without oversight. But at the same time, I can't shake the feeling that they're necessary. Because if not them, then who? The Adeptus Mechanicus, obsessed with their own arcane rituals? The Ecclesiarchy, burning entire populations in the name of divine purity? The High Lords, so far removed from the galaxy's reality, they might as well be ghosts? The Inquisition is brutal, yes, but at least it acts. That's why some fans call them the Imperium's conscience. Not a good conscience, not a moral one, but the voice in the back of the head that says, do what needs to be done, no matter the cost. It's utilitarianism turned up to 11. It's the blade that cuts so sharply you don't feel it until you're already bleeding. And in the age of the Dark Imperium, maybe that's the only kind of conscience that still works. But that doesn't mean we should stop questioning it. If anything, that's where we as fans have our part to play. The lore isn't telling us what to believe. It's showing us a system that forces hard questions. Is fear an acceptable foundation for peace? Is survival worth our humanity? Are purity and control sustainable values in a galaxy this broken? The Inquisition doesn't give us answers. It gives us the framework to interrogate the answers we thought we had. And that's what makes it so endlessly fascinating. Because every Inquisitor is a story, a perspective, a theory about what it takes to endure in a world gone mad. Some are monsters, some are martyrs, a few, just maybe, are heroes. And all of them live and die by the same idea, that the Imperium must survive even if nothing else does. So whether you see them as villains or guardians, fanatics or philosophers, I think we can all agree that the Inquisition is one of the richest, most layered parts of the entire Warhammer universe. It's not meant to comfort you. It's meant to make you uncomfortable, to make you look at what power does when it has no leash, and to make you wonder deep down if you'd be any different in their place. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the Inquisition, its origins, its ideologies, its weapons, and its endless contradictions, consider subscribing. There's still so much more in the grimdark galaxy to explore. We've barely scratched the surface of the heresies, the betrayals, and the moments of strange, tragic heroism that keep this universe so haunting and unforgettable. So hit that subscribe button and remember, just because you think you're loyal doesn't mean you're safe. The Emperor protects, but the Inquisition watches.